V, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you here. Dr. B, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here as well.
I'm not sure I believe that, but...
well, for V.
Okay, so V, let me start with you. And if you're comfortable, it feels like maybe the right place to begin this conversation is with your personal story, which I know is quite wrenching. So if you're cool with it, I'd be interested to hear your story that you tell in the apology.
Oh, we're going to go right for it. Okay. I came from, I think the way I would describe it is that I was kind of, I was boiled in a stew of violence, like I was made in that stew of violence. My father was, a corporate executive and charming and handsome and all those things that the world is always praising. And, on the outside was one thing and inside he was something else. When people say, oh, but he was such a nice person. And after he's killed, whole family or something, it was that kind of thing. My father just had two personas, and inside the family, he was tyrannical and dictatorial and violent and angry and alcoholic. And I was saying the other night, like if you grow up with a very, very intense personality as your mother or your father, your personality is formed in relationship to that, right? Like you either become defiant or you become passive or you become like mutated in some way around it, but that's the kind of forming element. And my father was very adoring of me when I was little, to the point where I think he couldn't handle his feelings because he had never been prepared in any way to have those feelings. And he crossed a line and he crossed a boundary and he sexually abused me from the time I was 5 until the time I was 10. And then whatever happened, whether it was he was being found out or it was getting too weird or whatever it was, he stopped. But to kind of prove to everybody that he didn't have those feelings for me and to prove to himself, he became very, very violent. And I would say from that point on until I left home, my life was just in dread, in terror, that at any moment he would explode, he would beat me, he would throw me against a wall, he would give me a bloody nose in a restaurant. It had obviously an impact on my life. I think it took me years to just even begin to have feelings because I learned early on to drink them away, drug them away, sex them away, do whatever I could not to have be in my body, not to feel my feelings, not to remember what had happened to me. And, it took a long time to find my way back in and a lot of kind of extreme situations to find my way back in. But I think, it also made me driven to spend my life and devote my life to ending violence against women, all women and girls in the earth, because I know what that violence does. It's not a moment. It's a lifetime to recover, to come out of that. It's in your body, it's in your soul, it's in your being. You have to struggle and struggle and struggle. I mean, I was listening to AOC talking yesterday about her assault and worrying about being pregnant. And I just looked at her face and I could tell it's still in her. It's still around her. That experience, there's a way in which you live in the present, but you're always in that past time, So I think it shaped a lot of who I am and a lot of what I decided I wanted to do with my life, which is to write and to find a way to stand up against violence.
I'm sorry that happened to you. Although I think the world is in some way the beneficiary of you, transmuting it into something really positive. I want to pause and just check in with you, Bianca. It's a pretty intense story, and we've only just started. Any reflections from you as you listen?
I mean, I have a tremendous amount of gratitude for you, and of course, your writing is formidable. I think for me, coming to this book in 2019 was sort of one of the top 5 or 10 books that was really transformative for me in the last 10 years or so. And there's more about that to discuss later, but part of it was just your ability to be so open with what had happened and to take this very, very unique perspective on things. And I know we haven't even introduced the book yet, but it's very difficult to, speak about what you went through without thinking about your words on the page in describing what you've been through. And so for that, I thank you in a million ways.
Thank you. I think the apology was, wow, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. But it was also, I think what happens to survivors or people who've been through enormous violence is that you are always in your predator's narrative, right? Even when you're resisting it, even when you're fighting it, even when you're always in their story. And I realized, around 2018, I didn't want to be in my father's story anymore. I didn't want to be reacting to him, proving to him I wasn't the stupid person he said I was, proving to him I wasn't a slut and I wasn't a whore, proving to him, or just being angry at him, because all that anger got transferred onto the world. And I suddenly realized I want to be in my story. There could actually be another story outside of this thing that he created. And one of the great things about writing the apology was it broke me out of his story, because I was finally willing and able, because it took me years to be able. And I think it takes survivors as long as it takes you to get prepared to do what you need to do. I was finally able to see my father beyond the monster, right? Not to justify his actions, never, but to understand them, because I think that understanding is liberation. I think when you come to understand things, you get free. And taking that journey was such a powerful thing, because I climbed into my father. I climbed into him. And you know what? It didn't take a lot, because the reality is our perpetrators live inside us. I can tell you more about my father than my father knows about himself. I literally would listen to the sound and the weight of his footsteps to know if I was going to get beaten. I can tell you from his laugh what he was feeling. We all can read our perpetrators because we are in tune to the terror, in tune to their moods, in tune to what will happen. And so when I kind of summoned my father in at the beginning of writing the book as an ancestor, because he was dead 31 years at that point, I feel like he came, and I feel like in some way we wrote this book together. And he would literally wake me up at 4 a.m. and say, go to your office. I'm going to tell you a story. And I would go and I would write things I had never heard in my life before. Right. So I think there is a way that, the dead, I say this in the book, that the dead need to get free too. The dead need liberation if they haven't done the work in this lifetime to address their misdeeds, shall we say,
It might be worth getting you to say a little bit more about the conceit of the book, which is, and I'll tee it up and then you can pick it up from there, that you never got an apology from this man and you figured, maybe I'll write one myself.
I think I waited my whole life thinking that day was going to come where my father, particularly when he got older, you get a little more vulnerable when you're older and you sort of want to patch up your life. I dreamed that call would come and he'd say, come, and I want to tell you all the things I did and why I did that. And it never came. And ironically, even after he died, I would kind of go to the mailbox sometime thinking there'd be a letter from the ethers with that apology. I mean, I can't tell you how many women I know in this world who are waiting for an apology, right? It would just be like, if you ask them all to come into the streets of every country in the world, the streets would be filled. I finally said, well, I'm not going to get that apology for him. But what if I actually wrote his apology and said all the things to myself and told all the things to myself that I needed to hear? And the minute I decided that, it was like everything began to line up. Like I said, my father, the spirit of my father, the ancestor version of my father showed up. And it was a 9-month process. I didn't really leave this office where I'm in. I've slept here. I ate this book. I drank this book. I was just like in it. And it was excruciating at moments and it was unbearable at moments. But the last line of the book is, "Old man, be gone." And I don't know who wrote it at that point, my father or me. But when I said it, it was like my father went shh and disappeared into the ethers. And he's really never come back. We're done. We're done. And I have no rancor. I have no bitterness. I have no rage. We're complete in this world. But I have no desire to be connected to him anymore either. Thus the name change,
You said something before that it seems relevant to what you just said, which is understanding is liberation. Can you maybe unpack that a little bit?
I think for so long, I didn't want to know what motivated my father to beat me or to molest me or to abuse me. It was just like he was a horrible person and that was that. I didn't want to know anymore. but I was still caught in that story because I was still in reaction, right? And when I wrote the book, I began to see the antecedents of my father's life, what tracks got laid down in him emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, that allowed him and catalyzed him to ultimately behave the way he did with me. And seeing that my father grew up, in a patriarchal household, seeing all the elements of my father's life that turned him into somebody who was adored but never loved, was honored but never cared for, who was abused by his brother, who never had any opportunity to share his feelings, to share his vulnerability, to speak from his heart. I saw the journey of my own father to close his heart, to become a discompassionate person. And it made me realize the biggest takeaway for me of that whole book was it had nothing to do with me. Right? My father, whoever was standing in that position in my father's life would have been the person he put that rage on, who adoration on. It was not about me, my soul, my personality, my being. And that was the greatest liberation, because I think for many of us who've been abused, we can't help but believe it's our fault. We did something to bring it on, particularly when you're a child, because it's so much easier to blame yourself than to blame your father. He's your parent. He's the person you love. There must be something intrinsically wrong with you. Why else would he do this to you, right? And why else would he have adored you for so long and then turned on you and then suddenly beat you out of nowhere? Like, you must have done something to evoke this. And I think writing that book, understanding who my father was, understanding what his journey was, freed me to understand it had nothing to do with me, right? So I think sometimes we don't want to get close to things because it's too much and it hurts too much. But also we nurture our revenge, we nurture our rage, we nurture like all the ways it keeps us alive. But for me, my desire for liberation is the strongest desire I have in the world. It's just to be free, to be free, to be free. And that book was a huge step in moving towards liberation. And I highly recommend it to people to write. A friend of mine told me in his group therapy, they're using the book now for patients to write apologies to themselves. And it's really been very successful. And it's City of Joy, which is this huge place we run in the Congo. They're using the same method for young women who have been abused by sexually abused, to write to their perpetrators apologies to them. And it's been very successful in releasing a lot of things that people have been carrying around.
There was something you said there about your desire for freedom, psychological freedom, liberation is the word you used, and not wanting to walk around nursing your desire for revenge consciously or subconsciously. And it reminds me of something another guest on the show said recently that's been knocking around in my brain. And I'll say it and see if it lands for you, V. The guest in question here, his name is Matthew Brensilver. He's a Dharma teacher on the left coast. And he said there's no such thing as a closed-hearted happiness.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. And the thing about it is, wherever your heart is closed, right, that's where you have to do the work. Right? Wherever there's in Buddhist practice, I used to practice, they would say that aversion to something, aversion to a person in your life is a sin, like not being able to go near them. And that's where your heart is closed, right? Where something has hurt you so badly that you shut it off. And I think the journey of the apology was going back and going, we're going to open up all these places that have been closed. I didn't want to see my father as a vulnerable child. I didn't want to weep over the fact that he had been categorically shut down as a child and not allowed to feel and not allowed to be vulnerable or open. And that no one ever occurred to anybody that he needed to be held or embraced because he was independent and he was fine, And I think that led me to opening the last portal, one of the last portals of my life where I was closed, which had to do with, I'm not going to get into because I don't talk about my other family member, but it had to do with my brother, which I just finished like that surgery recently of really like, why couldn't I feel what was going on in me that I had to close that in my heart. And I think, the more we can allow ourselves to open up the parts that we've determined off limit, like we're not going to ever go there, we're not going to touch that. The wound is the portal. That has been proven over and over in my life. The wound is the portal. And I used to have a friend, who used to say, what we resist persists. What we resist persists. It will become the thing that eventually takes over wherever you refuse to go.
And we do have to be careful here, and I suspect you'll agree with what I'm about to say, which is, yeah, you want to open your heart, but you also want to have smart boundaries, so you're not, inviting a victimizer back in or somebody.
Oh no, I'm not saying that you should open your heart to that person. Let me be clear. Like, I'm saying you have to work with somebody or work with people who will help you clean up inside yourself. I'm not saying go open yourself to your perpetrator. If your perpetrator hasn't changed, absolutely not. No. I'm talking about the inner work that you're doing. The inner work you're doing with yourself through therapy, through spiritual work, through writing, whatever it is. I don't really think it's necessary to do it with the person who's harmed you in a weird way. I think all of the people who have harmed us live inside us. We can have plenty of dialogue with them and rearrange the way they exist inside us if we do the deeper work. That's my experience anyway.
Amen. Bianca, I want to do a pulse check with you. Any thoughts on any of the foregoing?
I have so many thoughts. Just trying to figure out which ones are relevant to this discussion versus, to take to my own therapist.
Oh, bring them up. Bring them all up.
I will spare you, Dan, I promise. I feel blessed not to have had, obviously, the trauma that you have had specifically. And so anything I say now about how your story and your writing relates to me, just to say that I'm not putting myself in that category to at all minimize what other people have gone through in terms of how I am also trying to relate to my father or my parents and using the tool that you've given us to do so. Because I think what is just so generous of you is that this story is for survivors and is just for people. Your book came to me at a time where I really wanted to investigate my own personal narrative. And I think this was the first time that I really saw that narrative, not only, I did know that it certainly came from my, formative experiences in life with my parents, but I never assumed that their narratives had nothing to do with me. And you use the term double narrative or triple narrative even in order to understand your own. If we truly are double and triple narratives, you just cannot without understanding theirs to the best of your ability. And when this book came to me and I was having a reckoning with all sorts of issues around, my body in the setting of breast cancer and walking away from medicine, which was a huge identity issue, and my father getting diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, the ability to ask questions and get answers from the outside were really kind of becoming closed in and impossible to get. And, we all, like you said, are waiting for apologies. And so I actually did recognize a lot of my father in what you talked about, without all the same, facts. And he was mostly a pretty docile human being. But I really appreciated your insight into what it might have been like for him to be revered, and for that to be an incredibly lonely, destabilizing place. Because that clue really helped me understand my father and everything that came from that. So yeah, just hearing other people's stories while you investigate your own narrative, I find to be absolutely invaluable. And I did come to it from a sort of intellectual, from that perspective and going for a diagnosis. And I really wanted a nice Venn diagram or sort of algorithm to describe why I am the way I am. But I think your book in particular, with all the complexities of it, just sort of helped me let go of that a little bit and still be able to move forward with some degree of healing, not being able to get the answers from the person that I had hoped to. So that was amazing for me.
I think it's really important we talk about apology, like what it is, because I think we live in a culture, in a country and families, because it's patriarchal. I really have discovered, one of the reasons I wrote the book is obviously I've been involved in a movement to end violence against all women and girls in the earth for 26 years. And over that time, I really waited for men who have been called out. Then the Me Too movement kind of happened we keep all connected in our movements. And all these men got called out, and I kept waiting for one man to come forward and make a public apology, say, I've gone to therapy, I've looked at myself, I've done self-reflection, I've really come to know myself. Not one man came forward. And then I thought, has any man in history ever made a public apology about raping a woman or sexually abusing a woman? I looked and looked and looked and looked, could not find one man in history who had come forward. And then I started to think, oh, maybe this is a column, an essential column of patriarchy. Maybe the non-apology is keeping patriarchy in its place. I started to really imagine what it would be like if we had a world in which men felt safe, where there was a method, where there was a process that you could go through to take responsibility, accountability for harms done in a way that would free you and the person you had harmed. It's one of the main reasons I wrote the book, to begin to kind of say, we teach children how to pray. We teach children how to meditate. But we don't teach what apology is. And I mean apology. I don't mean I'm sorry if I hurt you or I'm sorry if you feel bad. I mean deep, rooted, reflective apology that involves you investigating your own history and understanding what are the things that went into me becoming who I am. What exactly did I do? The detailed details of what you've done, because it's only in the details that liberation happens. What was the impact of that, short-term and long-term? And how I'm going to change so I don't do that again. It seems we live in a country that's very big on punishment. We have more people in prison than a third world country, right? We're really big on holding people and containing them and punishing them and making them feel worse. But we haven't created any process, any methods, any pathway for people to get free of the harms they have done and to free the people they have harmed. And to me, you can look at our whole history going back to, the stealing of lands in the first genocide that occurred in this country, through the 400 years of slavery and what happened to Black people, and never, ever making amends or reparations or apologies for that. And we can just see the repetition of all that over and over and over, because it's never cleaned up. It's never cleared out. No one's ever taken accountability for it. For me, it's so critical that we begin to see apology as a real process that could be part of our liberation,
I want to go very deep into that, V. But just on a sort of conceptual level, I think I'm hearing two things, but I want to check it with you. On the one hand, the apology is very legitimately and appropriately focused on your personal experience, and then of course extrapolating to violence against women and girls all over the earth, as you've said. So there's that. And then I'm hearing in some of your comments just now, and also in preparing for this interview, I see it in many of your writings and other public utterances, an emphasis on apology generally, inclusive of violence against women and girls, but inclusive of everything else too. Apology generally as, to use your term, a pathway to happiness. So am I understanding this conceptually correctly?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think let's just begin with violence against women, but you could talk about just about any experience that's happened where a person has been oppressed and hurt and been made to feel less than and destroyed or enslaved. Or so much of our experience, as certainly as mine as a woman, and I've heard this from many women, is not only do you not get apologized to for harms done, you generally get gaslit. Like you're made to believe that somehow this was your fault and you brought this on yourself and this was your problem. So it's always a double whammy. You know, my father would say, as he was throwing me against a wall, this hurts me far more than it hurts you. And I would think to myself, actually, it doesn't. I'm getting thrown against the wall. You're not getting hurt by this, right? But it was me. I had done something so terrible to my father that he was the one suffering, even in the face of me getting thrown against a wall. You know, I once heard a man read the apology, right? Publicly. I read sections of it. And I was in an audience with women. And I looked around the audience, and all around the audience, women were crying. And afterwards, I asked women what was going on. And they said, it was so amazing to be sitting in a room where a man was just even reading a text where he was apologizing, where he was being accountable, where he was saying that what happened actually happened, where he was owning his piece of the story, where he was vulnerable, where he was humble, where he was in that moment of humility, equal, right? We were all equals. We were all humans in the room. And I think that's what I'm talking about when I talk about apology. It's a process of excavation. It's a process of humility. It's a process of saying, I'm part of a story and I'm flawed and we're all flawed. And I take responsibility for how I'm flawed. And I'm not above and I'm not on top and there's not a hierarchy that I'm preserving in this moment. I'm releasing that to be in this equal human dialogue with you. And I think that's all any of us are hungry for. It becomes huge, our longing, because we're never fulfilled. But when you get down to it, I would say 90% of the women I've interviewed over 26 years in this movement, they've said the one thing they want is for the perpetrator to take responsibility for what he's done and own it and look at them and be responsible and say what he's done and actually show them that he will not do this to somebody else. That's what people want. And it's the most impossible thing to get. So the question is, why is that? Why is that?
I imagine most men don't feel safe doing so. And I'm wondering how we change that culture, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. Part of it is allowing men to be vulnerable. Part of it is allowing men to get out of this ongoing hierarchical state where they always have to be dominant and above, but where they get to be with and a part of. I saw that with my father. The adoration separated my father. It removed him from the circle of humanity, right? He was either above it or in his own self-reflection, hating himself, but he was never part of it. And I think it's been a huge damage to men that they've been so far removed from the circle, that they don't get to be in their hearts, that they don't get to share their vulnerabilities, that they don't get to apologize, because apology is liberation, you know?
Speaking as the only man in this conversation, I was, in many regards, cheering for Me Too. That environment is not an environment where I would imagine a lot of men would feel comfortable stepping forward and say, yeah, I fucked up. Here's what I did, because the consequences are devastating.
But there's been time now. You know what I mean? Like there's been years past that, you know, I get in the moment that maybe that wouldn't be the time. But I also think we haven't created the circumstances or the process or the platforms or the ways for men to do that in a way where they can safely feel like they can go through a transformation that is welcome, right? And I think that's part of the work we have to do. Like, how do we help people go through that process? A friend of mine told me they were using the book in London with people coming out of prison, that they read the book and then people go through an apology process and they take responsibility for harms done. And that made me really happy to think that it was generated some kind of group process where that could occur. But I also think we live in a culture where the people on top, right? The people who, quote unquote, leading are perpetrators who not only don't apologize, right? They rarely pay the price for it. They rarely get held accountable. So there's a way in which the suffering of people isn't taken seriously enough to bring people to the point where they would be pushed to make apologies, right?
We've been talking about violence against women and girls perpetrated by men. I want to be very careful not to minimize that in any way. It's gigantic. And I think you're also pointing to the fact that, and this is an observation that has been made many times on this show and elsewhere, but powerful nonetheless, that in many ways men suffer from sexism as well. And that patriarchy is not good for men.
No.
Because we are, talk about a closed-hearted happiness or unhappiness.
Yeah.
We are raised to armor up.
I think in some ways I used to say, and I still think, that patriarchy in some ways has been far more damaging to men than to women because we still have our hearts intact, right? And I see so many men who are so cut off, who don't even know when they're vulnerable, right? Who don't even have a memory of that anymore because I think about growing up in a family where my beautiful brother was this genius, just a genius. And he wasn't interested in sports and he wasn't interested in manly things. He was interested in ideas and the depth of punishment received for that, right? And the witnessing of that. I think patriarchy isn't a gender thing. It's a paradigmic thing. It's a structure that we're living in, right? Where we have all been taught over and over and over again that what happens in our hearts, what's happened to our feelings, what's happened is the least important thing, right? And conquering and dominating and winning and moving forward and being strong is what we're doing here, right? And all we have to do now is look at the consequences of that, what it's done and how it's ravaged the earth, how it's created wars everywhere, how it's creating rising fascism you look every country now, there's some fascist leader or fascist party rising up. We're at the apex of patriarchy, late stage patriarchy. So what we all have to really look at is this the paradigm we want to be living in anymore? And I was speaking the other day and I was saying we need like a global Marshall Plan to dismantle patriarchy. There was a time human beings lived here on this earth without it, and we could actually find a way to create another paradigm we could live in again. And I think we have to believe that it's not the only way of being here. But those who have power within that patriarchal system are not so willing to give it up.
Meditation is not just a quick fix. It is a practice to change all parts of your life, and you don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up. The Happier Meditation app meets you where you are so you can realize more than you thought possible with a flexible approach that grows with you and wisdom from some of the world's most insightful teachers. Happier helps you get more out of meditation so you can give more to every part of your life. Go to happierapp.com and start meditating in a way that truly fits you.
For some reason, I keep going to the Louis C.K. documentary that you and I watched recently, Dan, where, as much as men don't have necessarily a perception of safety or reality of safety and being able to be honest on the outside, we also don't know what kind of work they're doing on the inside. Louis C.K. is one of the, men that went down in Me Too and actually made a comeback. To what extent he's satisfied with it, I don't know. And the documentary is called Sorry, Not Sorry or something like this.
There you go.
There is no apology. And it's worse than that. It's sort of doubling down on him in some ways being the victim of the culture and of Me Too. And so I guess the first step in theory would be creating in some sense of internal safety for men or for people in general who are scared to look at themselves to do so. I'm biased, but I do think, Dan's work in the world and this podcast and other things have sort of, that he's done and others do, gives men and people a willingness to look at themselves. But I don't know, Dan, in your experience talking to men, do you notice a sort of shift in how men are talking to themselves and willing to sort of be honest and share?
First of all, thank you for that. You're definitely biased, but I appreciate it anyway. Just to say, I don't have any data, so I don't know what I'm about to say is totally anecdotal. But I've been doing this group workout thing that Bianca knows about with a bunch of guys on weekend mornings, and a lot of the people who participate are 20 20-something finance bros who at 53, when I was that age, the finance bros were, barbarians. And I probably was too. I've gotten to know a few of these kids, and because they'll call me now, and they're really interested in, how do I get better at self-compassion? How do I become more authentic? How do I deal with this anxiety? Yeah, I just find that fascinating, because none of those words were accessible to me as a 25-year-old. And so that gives me some hope.
I think it's very true that this younger generation is a very different generation. And I see a tenderness in men, and I see a vulnerability in men, and I see a desire to really do self-seeking and understanding that generations before weren't allowed to have, first of all, but certainly didn't have. That gives me a great deal of hope too, a great deal of hope. But I also think that the numbers of sexual violence are not lowering, right? The numbers of women being raped, the numbers of women being sexually assaulted and battered, that isn't changing. I think really the question is, what is going to motivate men to want to go through a process of taking responsibility, of accountability? Like what? Because unless you're willing, it doesn't happen. Unless you want it, you won't do it. So what is that thing? I maybe that I've been trying to figure out that since I was 10 years old. Like, what is that thing that triggers men, will trigger men to say, oh my God, how can I not be awake to violence against women? How can I not care that my sister, my daughter, my aunt, my mother, my girlfriend, my wife is being abused? That most important person in my life. How can I not wake up to that and give my life to stopping that? I don't understand it. I do not understand it. And I've tried from every direction to try to get like, what is holding men back from speaking to other men, from rising up to other men, from owning it, from looking at it? Like, why don't men want women to feel safe and empowered and to walk through the world and feel good about their bodies without being under threat all the time? What's holding men back?
I don't want to speak for all men, and I also don't have the data, but I can say that I know a lot of fathers with daughters, and none of them holds back from talking about this.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah.
But I think, that unanswerable question of just how can they not, that you're just, talking about now, I think there is a certain blindness that we're seeing, from even, your investigation of what your father's apology might have been. It's not a matter of seeing it and not having a voice or not wanting to do something about it. It's probably a lot of it is a matter of not seeing it, which comes from a whole other line of trauma, intergenerational and otherwise, that I think needs to be looked at first, or at least as much as sort of having your eyes open to, survivors and hearing from you and other advocates and seeing the sort of prevalence of these awful acts. But that willingness to look within, in part, is going to stem from fear. So finding the root of that fear, much of which comes from society, but also from individual stories, most of which also probably share a pattern of thinking from our parents, societal pressures, and then their parents, and it goes on and on. So understanding those narratives, I just think, is so critical for people to know how to face the world and interpret it, and in turn then speak up.
And I think it's also true, like that story in the apology when my father bends down to pick up a sick bird because he's having empathy for the bird, and that kind of gets beaten out of him. I think I can't tell you how many boys have come up to me, like at the Vagina Monologues or other places, and taken me aside and said, I so want to be a better man. I so want to be a different kind of person, but I don't know how to do it within the story of men, right? Within the community of men. And I think, if we bring up boys to be invulnerable, if we bring up boys not to have feelings for a broken bird, if we bring up boys not to cry, we're already stunting them in such a profound way. early on that I think it's very hard to get those feelings back later. That's all of our responsibility. That's parents, that's schools, that's everywhere that boys live. And I think mothers contribute to that too, as much as fathers sometimes, like getting their boys to man up and be tough in the playground and, fight back, and all those messages that we communicate, as opposed to letting our boys cry when they want to cry, and like stay in bed all day if they want to stay in bed all day, or whatever it is that allows them to have a full rounded humanity.
I'm really interested, as I'll just bring you into my mind as a podcast host. I'm always trying to make sure that every episode speaks to everybody. And as important as I think that violence against men, against women and girls is, and I think it's incredibly important, I'm also interested in apology as a pathway to happiness for everybody. So let's just go there if you're up for it. Why do you think apology is so important for everybody?
I think that no matter what we do in our lives, to cover up a bad action that we know is a bad action, it's a stain on our being. And in some part of our cellular makeup, we hold that in some way, right? And I think that if enough of that accumulates, you begin to get sick. You begin to get depressed. You begin to get worn down. You begin to get, your character begins to change. I think that human beings are fairly low evolved creatures on an evolutionary scale that are trying to evolve. We're deeply flawed. And apology is what we have to keep going, right? We're going to make mistakes. We're going to do things that come out of anger. We're going to do things that come out of aggression. We're going to do things that come out of cruelty. That's who we are. But what we have to correct that, to transform that, to alchemize that is apology, if it's done correctly. And I think it goes for every person in every situation, right? Like I kind of outlined this process when I did this TED Talk, like a 4-step process that everybody could go through every time they do something that's bad, right? Or something they feel is unkind, or something they wish they hadn't done, rather than going, I didn't do that, deny it, push it down, let it become a hurtful part of your body, let it move into your body. What if we had an ongoing process where, number one, you could say, I just did this. What in my story, what in my history, what in my makeup brought me to do that? Okay. I just snapped at you and told you you weren't smart enough to do this job. Okay. You're not smart enough. You're too dumb to do this job. Like, I'm sorry. Okay. Why would I be so unkind? Did someone say that to me in my own history? Did someone make me feel like that every day? Was I constantly told I was stupid? Was I constantly what? And am I projecting that onto you in this moment? Like, what is that investigation of my early life that led me to this moment where I could harm you in that way? Then what did I do? What exactly did I do that harmed you? I screamed at you. I put you down. I made you feel bad. I belittled you. I made you feel less. I did that. And that was cruel and that was harmful. And I take responsibility for it. And then what is the impact of that on you? You're going to walk around feeling terrible. You're going to walk around feeling stupid. You're going to be raging at me for making you feel that way. And then obviously the last thing is to really apologize and to clean it up. And I think if we were regularly doing this with each other, if we had a process that we just did ongoingly, even if we had like groups where we could do it, or we just got in the habit of it, it would change our lives so fundamentally that we wouldn't recognize them anymore. Because so much of what we do is build up. It's build up. You don't tell someone they've hurt you, or you hurt somebody over and over again without taking responsibility. That person moves away from you. They stop talking to you. You don't know why they've stopped talking to you. You feel bad that they stopped talking to you, but nobody ever shares why, right? There's no process where we can keep cleaning up our relationships. And I think if we could develop that in our families, in our friendships, in our places of worship, in our schools, where, even as a child, if somebody hurts somebody, you stop and you say, let's look at why you did that. Why did you grab that away from them and hit them with that? What was going on in you? So that you become conscious of your behavior and why you're doing that behavior. And maybe you begin to develop the mechanism so it will prevent you from doing that behavior because you brought consciousness to it. I remember a great therapist once said, whenever you bring consciousness to anything, it changes, right? So it's like, how do we create that process of ongoing consciousness? And apologies would absolutely do that.
So just to recapitulate the 4 steps there, the first is to say what you did in detail. The second is to ask yourself why. The third is to have empathy and feel what your victim or whoever you hurt felt. And the fourth is to take responsibility, apologize, and state a, action plan for dealing with it. Just to say to listeners, if, I'll send these, I'll do a newsletter. I will have done a newsletter this morning in which I list these 4 steps. But am I
would reverse them.
accurately?
I would reverse them. I say
Okay.
step 1 is
Really?
Yeah, step 1 is, why did I do what I did? What in my history led me to do it?
Uh-huh.
Step 2 is, what did I do? Detailed accounting. Third is, what were the impact of that on the person I harmed? And fourth, to make a true apology, indicating you would never do that again.
Is a true apology the same as making amends?
I think it's different. Apology to me is rooted in a fundamental humility that says, I am going to go to the bottom of my being to look at how I have harmed you in a way that you will feel heard and seen and felt in that doing so. Both of us will be released from that action, which is why I don't necessarily believe in forgiveness. Okay. I don't really like that word because I think it feels like a posture. I think if you go through a true apology process, you will be released from the rancor, the bitterness, all the things you carry. Often I hear survivors or people just saying, why don't you just forgive? Why? It's not actually up to me to forgive. That's really not my business. I don't know how to forgive somebody. I know how to go through a process where somebody takes responsibility for what they've done, or I take responsibility for what I've done, and that person hears it and feels it. And in doing so, whatever that energy is, that dark energy is, it gets freed, right? And I think that's pretty great. I don't think we need much more than that, But I don't know how to forgive someone. I don't even know what that would mean.
I really appreciate you saying that because I've had a difficult time with that word as well, particularly because understanding our perpetrators in all different forms doesn't necessarily make the feelings go away, right? You can understand, or you can have, parents, as I'm sure our kid will say as well, who did the best they could based on their circumstances.
Yeah.
But the fact that I felt like, I was in a vice my whole life, and I understand why doesn't sort of negate the fact that I've been suffocating,
Exactly.
So that sort of release, I think, is a really helpful way to look at it, because it's really what you need for yourself to just kind of move forward. And it's not really actually about the other person. It's the gift to yourself.
I've made apologies to people where I don't know if they've accepted them or not, but I know I was as true and as deep as I could possibly be. So I was freed from that, right? And that's all we can be responsible for, is taking responsibility. I've seen so many survivors, this mandate, this pressure to forgive. It becomes another form of violence in a weird way. Like, you have to forgive. No, you don't have to forgive anybody. It's not up to me to forgive. I don't even understand that. It's up to us each to do the work of self-accountability and being true and honest about what we really have done, and really exploring that deeply in ourselves. That frees up both of us. And that requires action. That requires commitment. Apologies are not for the faint of heart. You have to really make a commitment to that.
This is all very much reminding me of sort of a new teachings that I'm experiencing now from adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families, which is really based on the 12 steps of AA. And my therapist actually recommended this to me 10 years ago, and I was in no place to relate to it. And I am now. I'm not so into it that I could tell you what all the steps are, but obviously one of them is making amends. And so this really came up for me in the last 2 months, just observing myself one day in a moment of some suboptimal communication with Dan on something. And I had all the reasons not to communicate well. I was tired. I had pneumonia. You name it. I felt justified. But I heard myself, I'm sure he pointed out first what was frustrating. And I remember reflecting on it as not like the biggest point of contention in whatever, squabbles we may have ever had, but really like looking at it for the first time for what it was. And that took me back to this recommendation and really looking into it. And so, yeah, that accountability for who you are, even if it came as a response to whatever was inflicted upon you that you didn't ask for, is the only thing you can do. So there will be amends coming your way, Dan. I don't know when, and I don't know about what, but I really do appreciate that perspective. Like you can't unsee these things.
And I don't know about you, but whenever I make that apology, it feels so good. That's the thing to remind people. Like you don't walk away feeling bad. You feel cleared. You feel clean. You feel like you come through. The other day I got on an airplane and it was like a horrible, horrible moment. I got to the desk and they said, "Oh, your seat is not available." I had been given beautifully this business class seat that I was very happy to have, and it was gone. Right? As I got to the desk, right? And I tried not to go into airplane rage, airport rage, and I tried to calm myself down. And by the time I got in the plane, I was just in a miserable, bad mood. And this lovely flight attendant was being so nice to me, and I was being so not nice. And I called him over later and I said, "I am so sorry. I was just being so mean and so unkind, and I am so sorry." And he took my hand and he said, "It is the nicest thing in the whole world that you apologize to me." And for the rest of the ride, he kept bringing me treats and and I thought, this is so simple. It's so simple. We can just be jerks sometimes. We can be terrible people sometimes. We can not get our needs met and then be like in our animal nature, "Give it back to me." But it can also be remedied if you just go deeply into yourself and take a moment and apologize. And I really made a deep apology to that guy. So.
I love that story. I just want to challenge you a little bit on how simple it is. I mean, I guess on some fundamental level, it is simple. As somebody who experiences tsunamis of defensiveness and underneath that, a huge riptide of shame, like it doesn't feel that simple always.
The act of it is simple. Getting there is a different story. I mean, and in some ways, apologies are the hardest thing in the world to do because people aren't doing them, obviously, right? Like there's something we're holding back. But the act of it, once you do it, is very simple. That's if you understand the distinction I'm making.
Yes,
and I just want to say about shame, just even admitting you're wrong, the vengeance you feel that will come rain down on you as a human being to say, "I'm wrong," right? We don't live in a society that welcomes people's confessions or admissions of failure and wrongdoing. Part of what we also have to do is create the space where people can do that without being shamed, without being attacked, without being, like you'll be in the middle of a fight when I used to be in relationships, and you'd be in the middle of a fight and someone would apologize and then the other person would be like, "Exactly." And then they would start going on and on and on and revving off all the things you've done wrong. And you were like, no, wait, I just apologized. I'm not going to be condemned now for my apology, right? Because people then go off on you. And so part of it is we have to also create space where people can make apologies without being then attacked. That's a part of it.
Yes.
There's something happening in your brain there, but that you don't want to share.
There's always something happening in my brain, but it's usually less than you think it is.
I feel fabulous, like being in between you two. Like it's so
We like to make guests feel as uncomfortable.
You're the only thing defending me from being torn apart, so I appreciate you being.
That's
she just
not
said
a
she's
good look
making
for me.
amends to you. Come on.
I know. I'm kidding. I'm poking the bear. What I was going to ask you was that I know that you referenced earlier that you practiced Buddhism for a while and that you don't anymore. And I believe you told Marissa, the senior producer on this show, Marissa Schneiderman, that your current spiritual practice now is to like ask a series of questions. So I'd be curious about that whole story. Like you left the Dharma. What are you doing now? What are these questions, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I practiced Buddhism, Nichiren Buddhism for 15 years. I chanted. And then I got stage 3/4 uterine cancer, which was a really huge spiritual, physical upheaval of my entire being. And it took me in a very different direction in my life. I moved out of the city. I moved to the woods. And I actually became devoted to the mother, to the earth, to this greenness, to this world out here. And I have a practice now, and it's very much a practice of, I have this beautiful place that I go and I sit inside the earth. I sit inside the mother. And my work is to become and realize how absolutely integrated and a part of and one I am with this earth that we live on, and to allow her and it to inform me of what I am to do and who I am to become and how I am to serve. I think I fell in love with the earth 10 years ago. I was late. I was very separated from the earth because I was very separated from my body for a very long time. And when I came back into my body, I came back into the awareness of my connection to this glorious, glorious earth that we live on. And my practice now is to be in service to her and to find all the ways I can be alive in her aliveness, be connected in her connectedness, not, for so many years I was searching and searching and searching for family and searching and searching and searching for parents and searching. And I found the mother. I found that connected source of life force that every day brings me. And for my birthday, I live on this little commune. My friends built me what I thought was a prayer egg at first. It was just this beautiful outside thing that I go and now I realize it's my earthship, that I get in it every day and I 2 or 3 times a day and I pray and I ask the mother to let me see and feel and know how connected I am to this that is life, so that I can do everything in my power to fight for it, to preserve it, to have joy in it, to spread it, so that people know how much we have to save this precious thing we have. Because I think one of the reasons we're not fighting climate change the way we are and the destruction of the earth is so many people aren't connected to the earth anymore. And that disconnection is keeping us from doing everything in our power to save it.
So just to make sure that story lands with folks, you used to practice Nichiren Buddhism, which involves a series of chanting, of chants, and you got sick and you moved to the country and you switched to really sitting in nature several times a day and asking big questions about what's my job here.
Yep. I think what happened was, life is so amazing where it takes you, right? Like you just don't understand that having your body be kind of cut open and having 7 organs missing and 70 nodes, and you wake up and you're in this whole other state. It was the first time I was ever in my body when I woke up out of that operation. And I went on a journey where every day I landed in something I had been disconnected from. And when I moved to the country, it was as if this whole door opened to this world I'd been a city person my whole life, and I'm a latecomer to it, but I'm a devotee, and I want the rest of my years to be spent learning the trees, learning the rivers, learning the birds, being involved with every little creature that lives on this land and loving them and serving them and noticing them and paying attention to them, and it's a beautiful practice because it keeps me connected to everything that is alive and it keeps me alive. I was thinking this morning when I was sitting out and literally yellow leaves were falling like rain, just everywhere, just everywhere, just everywhere. And I thought, this is the most glorious thing I've ever been a part of in my whole life. Just to the wonder of it, the magic of it. And it's all around us all the time if we pay attention. And I've gone through my amends to the earth for not paying attention earlier. I spent quite a few years making those amends. So now we're in a new process together.
I'm interested, Dr. Harris, you grew up in Manhattan, got cancer, and moved to the country. So do you see yourself in V's story?
I do to some extent. And I never thought I would, for probably all the reasons that you felt that way. Notably that of all the things that weren't confusing about me, being a New Yorker was at the top of the list. And it was a point of pride, and I'd go down with the ship no matter what. And the feeling of being anonymous and embraced by the city and sort of invigorated by the life around me. But then I realized when we moved out here that the energy wasn't really from my life, and that energy really exists out in nature. I'm not saying I never want to be in the city, but I certainly think that it has helped me in ways that I probably can't even enumerate, find a sense of peace and understanding truly about all the things I really needed to understand. And I'm not even going out and like sitting under the leaves or walking around that much. I'm inside most of the time looking at them. But as a pulmonologist, to breathe fresh air, like I highly recommend it. And I did not know that for forever. So yeah, baby steps, but I really do appreciate it now in a way that I never thought I would.
And I think the longer you do it and the more time you spend, particularly with trees just fill us up. And I was exactly like you. If anybody ever heard that I had moved to the country like 10 years ago, they would have laughed. I was a diehard New Yorker. I woke up one morning and I didn't like the way it smelled, and I didn't like the way it tasted, and I didn't like the noise. And I was like, I am not in love with you anymore. I have fallen out of love. I like to visit now because we're no longer married. I go and I visit, and it's kind of like my lover, and I visit it and then I leave,
V, one last question for you before we let you go. You told Marissa that you've been working on a play on mental health called In the Body of the World, and used a phrase that I thought was interesting. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on it in our remaining moments. That you said you hope to do for mental health what you did for vaginas.
No. Okay. There's a lot of parts of that story that are true and parts that aren't. It's not called In the Body of the World. That was another book that I wrote. The contemporary title is This Is Crazy. I was hired by the National Mental Health Alliance to do a play that destigmatized mental illness and broke taboos. And they made a joke and they said to me, we want you to do for mental health what you did for vaginas, which was, I thought, hysterical. Like, no small order. Okay, we'll just whip that up. But I have to say, I've been working on the play for a while now, and we're doing our first reading next week, and I'm very excited. I interviewed a lot of really brilliant therapists and people in the field before I began because I wanted to get their take. What's the most important thing I can be thinking about? And every single one of them said the same thing. The medical model is over. We cannot keep treating people through the medical model. Like, if we do not start treating the systems, the thing that is making people sick, we will just keep doing this over and over. So I kind of feel like they gave me my marching orders at the beginning, like to really think about that in everything that I was writing. And I think in so many ways, whether we talk about this incredible loneliness that it just kind of engulfed America, right? The sense of people being isolated and on their own and not connected. It's really the river that we swim in that's sick, right? And that's what we've got to clean up. It's really looking at how do we build community? How do we build solidarity? How do we make everybody feel that they're part of a story, and that even whatever it is that you have, whatever illness you've gotten as a result of being in this broken, toxic system, it's your particular reaction to it. But we're all, on some level, mentally unwell. it's impossible to live in the system that we're in right now and not be mentally unwell. So part of it is like, okay, if we're all unwell, then let's do this together and stop pretending that some of us are okay and the rest of us aren't, you know?
I have one last question that I probably should have asked earlier, and it is taking us back a little bit more into your story. I hope that's okay. And I apologize too if it's too personal and not where you want to go. But, there is obviously a certain kind of violence in silence. And I'm just wondering if you've ever needed or yearned for or gotten an apology from your mother for.
I like that question, and I thank you for
Mhm.
asking it. I did. My mother and I went through an amazing journey before she died. And I hadn't talked to her for years. And she wanted to talk to me. And I said the only way I would talk to her if she would let me tell her everything that happened. And she invited me to do that. And it was very hard. We walked it through. And then she actually called me and said, it clearly is true. And I can tell you why it's true. And she started to lay out all the things that she had seen but not seen, known but not known. And then over the years, she really began to address it and look at it and see her part in it and own it. I have to say, I think about my mother because when I was going through cancer, cancer came back. And I got on an airplane and I flew to Florida and I was bald and I was so sick and I was in chemo and I was a mess. But I was really able to climb into my mother's bed as she was dying and wrap her body with my body and hold her and say, we're done. We're good. We're good. I got who you are and I got what you went through and I got what you believed and I got what you were able to do with me in this lifetime. And I so appreciate it. We left her and she left this world and we were clean. And I love her for that. And I'll tell you a beautiful story. When we did our first V-Day, which was the production of the Vagina Monologues, for 1,000 people and all these great actors performed in it. And at the end of the show, I ask everybody to stand who's ever been abused. And usually 3/4 of the audience stands, just about every woman. And then I ask everybody to stand up who's ever known anyone who's been abused. And my mother stood up. And I looked out and I saw her standing. And it was like, thank you. Thank you. And of course, it turned out she was abused. And of course, it turned out she was in denial. And of course, all those, things just filter into the next generation and filter into the next generation. And we cleaned it up. So there's not going to be any more generations that walk in denial and walk with that hurt. And that's a huge deal. And any family that can do that with each other, like it's changing your fundamental karma and it's changing the fundamental reality for anybody else who follows you. And that's the work we're doing here, is to clean it up and to get conscious and to be more loving and to learn to apologize so we can be even more loving.
That's an incredible story. Bianca, your dad died 5 days before this recording. Did you feel like that was a clean goodbye?
Yeah. I feel like I really identified with what you just said about your mom vis-a-vis my dad. There's a lot of hurt and a lot of unintentional hurt, I believe, and a lot of narrative that I carried my whole life that really hurt me the most. And even though I didn't really get him to overtly address that as he declined from dementia, what I did get was perhaps better, I'm not sure, a real sense of gratitude as he was sort of returned back to basic factory settings without the stressors of life for a short period in there. There was love of a dad for a daughter, and I saw sort of just the purity of what you can be without all the noise. And so gratitude in some ways was a substitution for an apology for things that he probably didn't know that I was waiting for an apology for. And to then be able to take that and with great love and generosity help him, pass quite peacefully last week. As a doctor to a doctor at the bedside in the hospital was just a full circle kind of healing, I think.
Well, that's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Well done. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Well done to you, V. Thank you very much for doing this interview. It was a huge pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, but just before we let you go, can you just remind everybody of the name of this book and where we can find out more about you if we want to learn more about you?
Yes. The book is called The Apology, and there's also The Reckoning, which came out after that, which are similar themes, but addressed in different directions. And it's called The Apology, and you can get it anywhere, and The Reckoning.
Excellent. We'll put links in the show notes. Such a pleasure to meet you, albeit virtually, and a great conversation. So thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you both. It's just beautiful to ride in the wave of your energy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, V.